If you've been following Gamergate, you're probably aware that gamers are dead. At least if you listen to the mainstream gaming press. Hell, they even created a guide on how to end gamers, just in case you didn't quite know how to do it yourself. But why did gamers have to die? What sense does it make to try and eliminate your own audience? To begin unravelling this question, we really have to look at the root causes. And one of these root causes is identity politics. Linked through most of these articles was this Tumblr post that you're looking at now. And linked in this Tumblr post is research on games and gamers by Adrian Shaw, a quote-unquote academic whose work is also hosted by the Digital Games Research Association, or DIGRA. The paper itself, Do You Identify as a Gamer? Gender, Race, Sexuality and Gamer Identity, was written in June 2011, and in first blush it seems to be a very strange way of approaching the issue. After all, gamer is simply a label that people self-identify as to show that they are gaming enthusiasts. Why would anyone involved in gaming want that to be destroyed? Especially as you would imagine that people involved in identity politics wouldn't be keen on the idea of stripping other people's identity away from them. The problem is very clear from the abstract here. The demand for minority representation in video games often focuses on proving that members of marginalised groups are gamers. And naturally, as a normal person, you're probably thinking, well, of course there are, quote, marginalised groups as gamers. There's absolutely nothing about being a gaming enthusiast that prevents anyone from any walk of life describing themselves as a gamer. The previous article is cited far more often than this article though. He could be a bunny rabbit for all I care. Identification with video game characters and arguments for diversity in representation from January 2011 by Adrian Shaw. This paper begins with, in media studies generally and studies of minority representation in video games, there are two main arguments for the importance of representation. First, people want to see people like them. This is part of the market logic argument. If you want people to watch, play, read something, you put people like them in it. Second, it is important for people to see people unlike them in order to garner a broader view of the world. This is the educational argument, and typically it is not seen as profitable. These arguments also tend to assume that it is possible to define what is good or bad about a given representation, and that good representation educates and bad representation is harmful. In both cases, there is a sense that researchers and marketers can predetermine how people see themselves, their identities, and how they will position themselves vis-à-vis a given text through identification, and this is why media representation is important. She goes on to say that the quote in the title comes from Julia, who identified as an African-American gay woman in her late 30s, while she played the game God of War. She goes on to say that of Kratos, that he's just the thing on the screen. He's holding the knives, that's all. She was not the only interviewee who felt this apathy towards the identity of her on-screen character, though most were more ambivalent than apathetic. She says that this troubles the dominant assumption that players invest heavily in the identities of their characters, an assumption you may well be wondering who is making. The answer, of course, is gender ideologues, who are obsessed with their own identities and the identities of other people. She finishes the introduction by saying that this paper looks at the relationship between how players identify with different kinds of video game characters, and concludes with the implications that this has for arguments about the importance of representation of marginalised groups in video games. By comparing the mission statements side by side, we can see an obvious incongruity between these two papers. The He Could Be a Bunny Rabbit for All I Care paper from January 2011 states that the paper looks at the relationship between how players identify with different kinds of video game characters and concludes the implications that this has for arguments about the importance of representation of marginalised groups in video games. The June 2011 paper, Do You Identify as a Gamer?, begins by stating that the demand for minority representation in video games often focuses on proving that members of marginalised groups are gamers. The implications of the results of the 2011 study is very clear. Shaw is actively looking at the ways players identify or do not identify with characters to find methods to advance arguments for demands for representation of these marginalised groups. The June 2011 paper has a decidedly different approach to things. The demand for minority representation in video games often focuses on proving that members of marginalised groups are gamers. In turn, it is asserted that the gaming industry should focus on appealing to these players via targeted content. Being targeted as a gamer, however, does not a gamer make. Identity as a gamer intersects with other identities like gender, race, and sexuality. Negative connotations about gaming lead people not to identify as gamers and to not even play video games. This article concludes, based on interviewed data, that those invested in diversity in video games must focus their attention on the construction of the medium and not the construction of the audience. This should tell us everything we need to know. It's clear from Shaw's research that she has examined the video game audience and gamers to see exactly how the importance of representation of marginalised groups in video games based on the sensible assumption that players will want representation. However, the January 2011 article is very rarely cited anywhere, whereas the June 2011 paper is cited frequently, most notably in the blog post from Dan Golding and linked through to the articles declaring gamers are over. So why exactly has Adrian Shaw decided it's not worth looking at the players of the games to find solid arguments for demands for representation of marginalised groups in video gaming? In the January 2011 article, He Could Be a Bunny Rabbit for All I Care, she says, little empirical research has investigated how the process of identification operates in video games, and what this might mean for demands for diversity in this medium. She gives a waffling outline of her methods and goals, and finishes with, players do not automatically take on the role of avatars, which has important implications for how one can argue for the importance of diversity in games. Again, a very interesting statement. The method she used to reach her conclusion was to survey people who she considered to be marginalised. She says a sample of interviewees who identified as non-heterosexual, non-male, and or not solely white/Anglo, i.e. those that fell outside of the heterosexual white male gamer stereotype prominent in the United States, were then selected from the completed surveys. This may seem like cherry picking, but she is directly attempting to find out how people she considers marginalised actually identify with their characters, so this in itself is fine. The only issue here really is her base assumption that gamers are white heterosexual young men. But this mistake is by no means a showstopper for this paper, because, like she said, she's actually looking to speak to non-white, non-male, non-heterosexual people who play games, and interrogate them so she can discover exactly how she can further make demands for representation for these marginalised groups. There appears to be a default assumption amongst quote-unquote video game academics that the best way for people to enjoy video games is by being able to identify with the player character, and it is apparently generally asserted that the interactive qualities of games make the possibility of identification greater in video games than in other media. And indeed, some of the interviewees similarly said that video games' interactive properties made them feel more connected with their characters. As Cody, a participant, described it, generally you have direct control over the guy in a video game, whereas you're watching someone in a movie. Another participant similarly said, the more control I have over a character, the more I feel I'm in the character. And to Shaw's credit, she really picks up on the nuance of what's happened here. In most of their descriptions, it seemed that interviewees identified as the on-screen character, in the sense that they are taking on the character's role in the game world, but they do not identify with the character in an intellectual or emotional sense. One interviewee said, when you are playing the character, there's so much going on and you are so much in control that you don't really have that outside perspective. She used questions previously written by someone called Cohen, which I don't have unfortunately, and they allowed her to discuss the differences between player and avatar and viewer and character relationships with the interviewees. They proved difficult to answer, but primarily this demonstrated the difference between identifying with video game characters and characters in other media. Most interviewees, for example, answered that they could get fully absorbed while playing a game. This was often a qualified yes, however. Context and reason for play mattered for involvement, because wanting to win was a reason for getting absorbed in certain video games more than strong connection to characters. Affirmative answers to Cohen's questions that would have indicated identification had occurred in television viewing merely signalled that a game was good, not that the player identified with the on-screen character. From this we can see that Shaw has actually discovered that yes, video games are different to traditional media, and it is you as the person controlling the character that is actually the fun part of the game. you don't necessarily need to identify with your player character or other characters in the game to enjoy the game and feel involved in it. The marginalised people that Shaw was interviewing said that they generally did not feel they were able to get into the heads of their characters and specifically identify with them. She says that the interactive aspects of video games made the process of identification qualitatively different from other media. As one interviewee said, "I'm going through it with the character, so I'm going through dealing with what they are going through but reacting a little differently." There is a self-referentiality to the interactivity that does not allow the distance necessary for identification with characters. Some players think about what they are doing, not what the character is doing, nor what they, as the character, are doing. To make that more clear, players think of themselves as their characters, so they think of the character's actions as their own actions, because, of course, vicariously in the simulated world of a video game, they are. Shaw also seems to fail to notice that people here are talking as if they are aware that video game characters don't actually have thoughts. She finishes by saying, interviewees wanted their character to succeed, but only because the goals of the character were the goals of the player. One of the interviewees described this process as being one with the character, but not of the character. Repeatedly, Shaw finds that the interactive nature of games is part of the reason that identification questions prove difficult to answer. Interactivity makes identifying with video game characters hard to pass from the involvement with the texts. Or put more simply, people don't identify with their characters because they believe their characters are actually an extension of themselves in the game world. And she says as much at the end of this paragraph. They did not think about their relationship with the characters per se, rather they thought about what they, the players, were doing. In this paper, she also covers that interviewees mentioned that many different kinds of video games allowed players to build their own characters, which obviously undermines any arguments for demands for representation in the game, as the players can choose their own representation. Creating a blank slate for a character, for the player to then portray in any way they choose within the game world, did nothing further to engender identification. In the case of some interviewees, this lack of detail caused them to be more self-aware than engaged in identification with the character. They were themselves, not the character, particularly in games that relied on caricatures. Games that leave characters too empty lose, perhaps intentionally, the chance that players will identify with the characters. Thus, merely creating character types to represent marginalised groups is not the same as appealing to marginalised groups through in-game representation. To sum this up in simple terms, players playing the game do not need to feel represented or to identify with any of the characters that they control, in order for them to fully enjoy the game as anyone else, members of marginalised groups or not. It seems that when asking her interviewees to choose characters in certain types of game, in this case fighting games, Adrian Shaw seems to have realised that she is dealing with gamers. Because when Sasha and Hatshepsut played Marvel vs. Capcom and Soul Calibur in their respective second interviews, both chose characters based on the fighter's abilities. And as some very sharp person called Newman in 2002 described, character choice in video games often has more to do with in-game advantages, to no one's surprise. And sometimes choosing a certain character, like when a male-identified player selects the princess from Super Mario Bros., can have more to do with the ability advantages, which may, in turn, downplay the risk of transgender identification. As Newman and Jenkins point out, researchers need to reconsider how and if players actually identify with these characters. Although Hutchinson analyses the various types of identity play and resistance made available in fighting games like these, it is important to consider that the identity of the characters may matter very little to some players. Unsurprisingly, most people who play a game are really interested in succeeding at the game. We may know these people as gamers, although I have no doubt that more casual players do the same thing. And only people who are particularly concerned in identity politics would care that a male identifying person would be worried about transgender identity play because they are controlling a female character. even when players get to make their own characters and they make their own characters look like themselves, Shaw can find no arguments for representation here either. And it may well come as a surprise to you, but Adrian Shaw's conclusion to this paper is probably very similar to the conclusion that you, as a gamer, have already come to. So going back to our introduction, she says this paper looks at the relationship between how players identify with different kinds of video game characters and concludes with the implications that this has for arguments about the importance of representation of marginalized groups in video games. So what are the implications for arguments about the importance of representations of marginalized groups in video games? Players do not automatically take on the roles of characters or avatars. Playing as a character that is ostensibly other to you in terms of gender, race, or sexuality is not necessarily transgressive or perspective altering. Playing as a character that is like you in terms of demographic categories does not necessarily engender identification. This calls into question both the educative benefits and the marketing benefits of playing as a main video game character that is a member of a marginalized group. Different gaming contexts also shape the types of choices players make in terms of how they create and play with as their characters. In addition, playing as, creating or choosing characters in games, whether online or off, cannot be confused with identity play. To sum this up more concisely, Adrian Shaw has discovered that there is absolutely no need to shoehorn in diversity because gamers are not interested in what their character is like. They are interested in what they can do with their character. Shaw has discovered that there are no arguments for the importance of representation of marginalized groups in video games because gamers do not care about them, which is why she then has to turn her attention on the construction of the medium because the audience isn't interested in her identity politics.